Dear students, as you know, the challenges of life do not have a timetable. As a result, it is impossible to adequately prepare in advance for every life challenge. We are in the middle of a worldwide pandemic COVID-19, accompanied by disruption of our normal mode of life, including instruction and learning. Course and module outcomes of James C. Revised Syllabus Assessments. 1. Exam 3 and the final exam will take place online in Blackboard through ProctorU. You need to go ahead and create a ProctorU account and watch the orientation videos for test takers in the Resource Center, https://www.proctorlive-resource-center. Instruction regarding proctored examination is found in the Proctor Guidelines Forms module, which is located above the Week 1 module. 2. In-class exercises will continue as bonus points to your exam score. The major change is to be renamed as GAG Project CH since we no longer have face-to-face classes and as summarized in the initial course assessment. Also available in Blackboard. 3. Presentations will be done remotely through Zoom screen share as well as posted as a YouTube video clip in the weekly module. 3. Types of exam 3 and final exam will be multiple choice questions instead of problem solving or fill in blank questions. This change is due to low scores of students when they were problem solving questions. 4. Course materials contain same textbook. 4. Course technologies. We will use Zoom to meet virtually. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had in-class face-to-face class session on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Our new virtual meeting room is https://zoom.my/physics without tears. We will use this link each time we have an online class session. The meeting ID is 457,705,154 in case you're joining from your browser. Grades will be updated at the end of every week in Blackboard. Virtual class meetings and office hours. Since class members are in different time zones, I will give flexibility of either synchronously or asynchronously participate in the webinar. 5. Virtual class meetings and office hours. Since class members are in different time zones, I will give flexibility of either synchronously or asynchronously participate in the webinar. The weekly meeting will be recorded and posted in the weekly module in BP. While I will miss the face-to-face meetings, I encourage you to take advantage of the flexibility that comes with online course delivery and learning, including 24/7 access to course materials, ability to rewind and review the recorded virtual sessions, studying during your most productive time, one-on-one virtual meetings with instructor, no need to physically come to one geographic location. However, I must warn you that studying remotely requires more self-discipline and time management, as you may be tempted to think that you have more time, resulting in procrastination. You must deliberately set aside 4th, 2020. All the best, Dr. Sun.
All these curves are derived. I'm also going to show you how to calculate the profit, revenue, and cost for monopoly. And finally, I'm going to show you what happens to consumer surplus and price and quantity when you compare a monopoly with perfect competition. Simply put, the demand curve for a monopoly looks a lot like the market demand curve because they are the market and they control the market and they set prices and quantities. So at this price, in this quantity, I can calculate revenue for the monopoly, and that's that point right there. So I take total revenue is equal to price times quantity, or P times Q. The first thing I'm going to do is build the total revenue curve. So I'll bring down the quantity straight down, and on the vertical axis, I'll plot total revenue. So at this particular level of quantity, this is at this level of quantity, that is my total revenue, right there. I'm going to do this at several different price points and quantity points. At high prices, the monopoly doesn't sell very much, and they don't get a lot of revenue. At a more moderate price, they sell quite a bit more, and this is their revenue level right there. And at lower prices, they sell more, but they actually make a little bit less money, a little less revenue. And that would be the point right there. So this is what the total revenue curve looks like. It goes up and then back down. Average revenue is worth mentioning as well. And the way I calculate average revenue for a monopoly is I take total revenue divided by quantity, that's average revenue, which is price times quantity divided by quantity. So those two quantities cancel out. So it turns out that average revenue is always equal to price. So whatever my price is, that's my average revenue, regardless where I'm at on the demand curve. It turns out the demand curve and the average revenue curve are exactly the same, because demand, in this case, is equal to average revenue. Marginal revenue is always a little tricky. I'm going to do that one now. And marginal revenue is the change in total revenue due to a change in quantity. And change, I'll use a little delta sign, the Greek letter for delta. My first level of quantity is right there, and my associated total revenue is right there, and I'll plot that across. So I have TR1. If the monopoly increases quantity to level Q2, right there, total revenues rise. So right there, total revenue 2. What I'm actually going to show you is the slope. If you remember, the slope is rise over the run right there. So I'm going to take the rise divided by the run, which is the slope. That's the same thing as rate of change, by the way. So I take total revenue 2 for my second quantity minus my first total revenue 1, divided by the second level of quantity, or Q2, minus Q1, the first level of quantity. And this is equal to a change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity. Again, change is that little delta sign, Greek sign for delta. And this is equal to marginal revenue. It turns out that marginal revenue is just the slope of the total revenue curve, and that's that green line there. And the slope's not constant, and it changes all the way through the total revenue curve. This point's a very important point because there the slope is 0, and so is marginal revenue. It's 0 at that point. And if I take the point up there and I draw my line straight down like that, that's my marginal revenue curve. To the right of the dotted line, marginal revenue is negative, the slope is negative, as you can see. So by definition, marginal revenue is equal to change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. There is nothing special about the marginal cost and the average total cost curves for monopoly. It's calculated exactly the same as for perfect competition. So I'll draw those in. Marginal cost and the average total cost. The marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue cross is the level of quantity produced. Now, if I take it and I draw straight up, that gives me the price for the monopoly as well. So total revenue is equal to price times quantity. Again, if I go from the quantity up to the average total cost curve and across, this gives me my average total cost, which is the area of the red triangle. It's average total cost times quantity. That's the area. And if I take total revenue minus total cost, that's the profit, which is that black area there, the area of that black rectangle, I should say. The height is P minus average total cost, or price minus average total cost. The base is quantity again. So profit is equal to quantity times price minus average total cost. Again, profit is total revenue minus total cost. So in perfect competition, the market will produce a point right there and produce a quantity which is much higher than a monopoly would produce. And their prices would be less as well. In other words, monopolies charge more and produce less. Under competition, that's consumer surplus, but under monopoly, consumer surplus shrinks. The consumer is worse off.
So first up, let's think about monopoly pricing when we have this market power. A monopoly is a market served by only one firm. In this situation, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but it does not equal the price. In a price taker world where there's many firms competing, we have marginal revenue is equal to the price, is equal to the marginal cost, is equal to the demand curve if we draw it up. But here with market power in a monopoly setting, this will not be true. The firm still wants to follow the rule of rational life and keep acting until marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost, which in this case, the marginal benefit is the marginal revenue for the firm. So we're going to keep producing until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But given our monopoly power, given our market power in this monopoly setting, that will not lead us to a situation where we charge price equals marginal cost. A profit maximizing firm with market power will expand output as long as marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, but price will be lowered and output will be expanded until marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but it will not be lowered such that it is equal to the marginal cost. The price charged by a firm with market power will be greater than its marginal cost. So let's look at the standard textbook graph of a monopoly situation. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to assume constant marginal costs, though this not always be the case. We will look at other graphs where we have marginal cost curves that are different than constant returns. So it could be that it's our standard upward sloping, but here we're just going to do the simplest model to introduce the graph that we have. And what we do is just what we would do in any other kind of firm situation. Is the first thing you want to do is you want to think about where is marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. Here we have this downward sloping marginal revenue that we will talk about in another video lecture. But we want to set that point where we have marginal revenue equals our marginal cost, and then this becomes our quantity that we are going to be concerned with. So you always find that marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and this is our quantity. Then what we say is at this quantity, this is our monopoly quantity, we now can say with that quantity, how much can we charge given the willingness to pay of consumers within this market? We can find that point at that quantity and where it hits our demand curve. So that will tell us the willingness to pay for that quantity of output given the market preferences of this situation. So the monopoly price becomes the point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, gives us the quantity, and where that quantity hits our demand curve gives us that price. So here we have the monopoly quantity is this QM, and the monopoly price is this PM. This is different than the competitive situation where the marginal cost, representing kind of our supply curve here, crosses our demand curve. Here we would be out at this point, right? And we would have this quantity competitive and this price competitive. So we would end up with greater total surplus in that market as we serve more consumers. And so our total surplus would be this entire triangle would be consumer surplus in a competitive market. Whereas here, we're not going to have that much output, and so we're not going to get as much total surplus, right? So we're going to stop the market at this point QM up to A on the demand curve here. And so this area of consumption between QM and QC does not happen. So those transactions do not take place. So what we can think about here is what's going on with the surplus in this situation then. For the units that are actually consumed and produced, right, we can think about the producer surplus for the firm. Everything below the price you actually get to charge, but above the cost that you face. And so the firm faces this cost, their supply curve of this MC, and for all the units that they sell, they get to sell at this price, PM, and so our producer surplus becomes this box here shaded in green. Okay. Everything below the price that they get to sell at, but above their cost for those units. That becomes producer surplus. What we leave behind is these transactions that do not take place, these transactions between QM and QC. Well, how much benefits do those transactions provide to society? Well, they provide quite a bit. The difference between our willingness to pay and what it actually costs us to produce for all of those units is surplus that we no longer get because we don't engage in these transactions. We don't engage in the transaction where we say, oh, here's the willingness to pay and here's the cost. We lose that much value from all of those potential transactions. These transactions should take place, but do not. And so this entire blue region here shaded in, this triangle, A double prime E, E, is deadweight loss. So we have all of these areas being deadweight loss because the transactions don't take place even though they should. We also have that producer surplus triangle or rectangle from the transactions that do take place. And then finally, we can think of the consumer surplus. The consumers in this situation do get some surplus, right? Everything below their willingness to pay, but above the price that they actually have to pay. So they get this triangle up here, PMA, PMax, right? So they keep some consumer surplus. This is quite a bit smaller than the consumer surplus they had in the competitive situation where they paid the price PC and consumed all of these units out to QC, right? Where we get this much larger consumer surplus situation. But nonetheless, they do keep some of the consumer surplus. And so producers and consumers get some surplus. Society as a whole takes on some area of deadweight loss. But we have this kind of standard setup of the monopoly situation, and we can see that it's less efficient because we now have had some deadweight loss entered into society. So this is this pure monopoly situation, and we have to think about this kind of context. This is the basic setup. You find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's your quantity. You take that quantity and see where it hits your demand curve, and that will tell you your price. And then you can analyze the surplus and deadweight loss from there. So here we can bring in a little bit more complex analysis, and we can have an increasing marginal cost curve, and we can look at the profit from the situation. Remember that profit is total revenue minus total cost. It is not just comparing to your marginal cost or to your variable cost. So what do you do in this situation? Well, here we're bringing in our average variable costs and our average total costs to analyze what's happening. The first thing that you do is you have to go and find where marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue. Okay? And so what you do is you find where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. This is where the firm, following the rule of rational life, will produce at this quantity here, Q. So that's the first thing that we find, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You take that quantity and you say, okay, I am capable, given the demand conditions of this market, of charging a price of P in this market, where that quantity hits the demand curve. So that becomes my quantity, that becomes my price, and then I can analyze from there. To think about the total revenue of the situation, what I have to do is I have to think about price times quantity as giving me my total revenue. So my total revenue in this situation is going to be this big box of price times quantity. So this entire area is my total revenue here, right? So that orange box highlighted over plus the white gives us that price times quantity for all of my outputs. That's my revenue from that situation, right? Now I have to do total revenue minus total cost to figure out my profit. Well, what are my total costs from this situation? My total cost from this situation is, I can think about, okay, at that quantity that I am producing at, Q, I can think about what are my total costs in this situation by thinking about what are my average total costs in this situation at this quantity. I don't care about the rest of the curve, this slope up here. It doesn't matter. At this quantity, this is my average at this point. So what I can do is I can figure out my average total costs, give me this is how much it cost me per unit for all of those units. And I can say, this is how much it cost me, ATC, for how many units? For all of these units up to Q. So the area that represents my total cost curve then becomes this lower box here that I'm shading in green. Right? That becomes my total cost. I can take that point on my average total cost curve and I can say that is the current average total cost. So multiply that by my quantity will give me my total cost. It doesn't matter what my averages were up here at all. Think about it. If you're at a situation where I say the current average that you have is 25, and you have done this for 4 units, what are your total costs? How would you figure that out? You would say my average, 25, times the total units that I have, 4. So my average total costs, 25 times my quantity, 4, would give me 100 as my total cost. It does not matter if my average at some point in time, say after the first unit produced, was 75. It doesn't matter if it was up here. All that matters is what is my average now at the quantity that I am producing. So I take that average total cost, right? This amount's right here, and I say, okay, that's my quantity, that's my total cost, average total cost, and then for how many units, and I from that can figure out my total costs. And so it would be this box here. And so what I end up with is this total revenue is the bigger box, and my total cost is this smaller box. The difference between the two would be the orange box that remains, and that would be my economic profit from this graphical setup. Economic profit is not the same thing as producer surplus. Just as a little reminder here, producer surplus is the difference between the total revenue and the total variable cost. We can represent this by showing the area between the price they receive, the firm, and the marginal cost for each unit. Producer surplus is the difference between what you'd be willing to sell at and what you get to sell at. This is a short run type analysis. What you would be willing to sell at is a short run decision. You analyze this decision based on your average variable costs, not your average total costs. Thus, the difference between profit and producer surplus is the fixed cost of production. So if we're thinking about the producer surplus, what we actually want to do is we, in this situation, are going to get not only the profit, the orange rectangle here, but we will also get the purple region here. This is the costs above their marginal costs. This is what they would be willing to produce in the short run for the units that we produce. So again, we think about the quantity that we would produce at, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We get our quantity from this context, and then we can determine our price from that quantity. And now we can say, okay, well, for all of these units that we're producing, what would we in the short run have been willing to produce these at? What cost? And we can think about that as our marginal cost curve for all of those units that we're producing. Now, because we have this kind of changing rate of marginal